Hi everybody, it's your life science / biology teacher, Mr. Poser, and today we are starting a new unit. Unit 8 is on natural selection, and it's really, well, it's called natural selection, but it's really all about the unifying theory of biology, which is evolution. And today our topic is how we know evolution is a thing. It is perhaps the most misunderstood, but also the most important theory in all of biology, maybe one of the most important theories of all of science. And we're going to talk about what that is today and how we know it's a thing. So let's get started. Here's a couple questions. You're related to every living thing that has ever existed in one way or another. How is that possible? Look at, here's the tree of life connecting everything together. What actually is this tree of life? We're going to talk about that later on. And the other question I have for you that kind of serves as a starting point for this video here is that biologists say dinosaurs never actually went extinct. So if you ask me, I would tell you that dinosaurs are actually still a thing and they never went extinct. So how is that possible? How is it? I mean, 65 million years ago, the asteroid hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, right? But maybe not. Okay, so let's talk about what this is all about here. This is evolution, the most important concept in biology, if you ask me. It is the process of biological change by which descendants come to differ from their ancestors, aka descent with modification, as Charles Darwin called it. And speaking of Charles Darwin, this is his tree of life. That picture that I just showed you earlier, that is like the more modernized tree of life here. But this is his first sketch, his first idea of a couple of huge concepts in biology and why living things are the way they are and how they become the way they are. And evolution tells us three main points here. Number one, species change over time. Okay, no species has just stayed stagnant throughout its entire existence, and species change over time. And keyword is there, species, not organisms. Okay, if I won't grow gills if I decide to live in the ocean. That's not evolution. Okay, I'm not just going to evolve to my environment. Organisms don't evolve, species do. So that's point number one. Species only come from other pre-existing species, and all species are related to one another. And that's where this tree of life comes in. Every single species is part of a branch of this tree of life here. So just like branches come off of a tree, species come from other species. So where else have you seen a tree, and branches comparatively? Well, you've heard of a family tree, right? So you got your mom's side and your dad's side or something like that, and you can trace down where you are and where your cousins are and that kind of stuff. So that's a family tree, and I'm going to tell you right now that life itself is just one big giant family tree, and every single organism is related to every single other organism. We're all just one big happy Earth life family over here, aren't we? That's what evolution is all about, and these are the huge concepts that really tie everything together in biology. So everything that we've learned about and everything that we will learn about is going to come back to this idea. So as I said, it is the unifying theory of biology. It's a theory, okay? And if you remember my first unit, we talked about the difference between a hypothesis, a theory, and a law. And a theory isn't just somebody's guess. Or like, oh, why my theory is this? Like, no, a theory is a really, really good explanation. Well, evolution is a really, really strong theory, and a strong theory is an explanation for many, many, many different forms of evidence that we can find within the natural world, right? So this is what evolution explains, the three main things that evolution explains. It explains why living things have so much in common, or aka the unity of life that it explains. It explains why there's so many different living things, which is the diversity of life, and it explains why living things are so well adapted to their environment. Okay, so if you've ever wondered, like, okay, how is it possible that a stick insect is able to look exactly like a stick, or why is it that a polar bear is got white fur and it's so good at holding its breath and so good at staying insulated in its cold environment? Like, evolution explains that. Okay, it also explains why there are so many different living things. Why isn't there just one type of living thing? Why aren't we just like it? Okay, well, evolution will explain all of that. Okay, so evolution is among the strongest theories in science due to the overwhelming amount of evidence that supports common ancestry. And when I say common ancestry, this is what I'm referring to, is that species come from other species, right? So between you and your sibling, who's your most recent common ancestor? Okay, think about it. That would be your parents, right? So you're more closely related to your siblings than you are, say, to your cousins. So who's the most recent common ancestor with your cousins? Well, it'd be your grandparents, and with your second cousins, it'd be your great grandparents, right? So here's the thing: the more recent common ancestor two species have, just like because species come from other species, the more recent common ancestor two species have, the more closely related they are to one another. Okay, and we've got actually seven forms of evidence that we're going to discuss today that support that evolution is actually a thing, and it's true. It's a fact. Okay, so the first one is molecular similarities. The first piece of evidence here is that every single living thing that we've discovered on Earth so far has DNA. Okay, every single living thing has DNA as their code. And to some extent, all living things share a little bit of DNA. We can study nucleotide sequence to determine homology. The more related two species are, the more DNA they will share. Okay, so if species don't come from other species, then why do we all share DNA? That's a really great question. So if you recall, these A's, T's, C's, and G's, those make up our DNA, right? Two different strands, double helix, that whole thing. We share a little bit. Species share a little bit, like no matter what the species is, right? So here's an example of that. What percent of the DNA from these organisms is identical to humans? Okay, so if you want to try and take a guess, go for it. Pause the video, and I'll show you in just a second. Okay, but here we have yeast, a fruit fly, a chimpanzee, and a mouse. What percent of their DNA do you think is the exact same as ours? Okay, and I'm about to show you here. If you can believe it, which is it's true. Okay, you should believe it. Yeast actually shares 17% of its DNA with a human. 47% of a fruit fly's DNA matches that of a human. 88% of a mouse, and 99% of a chimpanzee. So these are we often refer to chimpanzees as our cousins, meaning that we share a more recent common ancestor with chimpanzees than any other animal, than any other form of life. Hey, that doesn't mean we came from chimpanzees. Do you descend from your cousin? No, you descend from your grandparents, right? You descend from your great-grandparents, and so on and so forth, right? So we and chimpanzees, we have a more recent common ancestor. We have the same grandma, in comparison to other species here. Okay, so that's molecular similarities. The second one is Hox genes. Hox genes determine the location of body parts in a developing animal, i.e. the location and the number of eyes, the wings, the tail. And something that's crazy about Hox genes is that they are similar among all vertebrates and all animals, really. All animals have the same kind of body plan, and it's all due to these Hox genes. They all have the same or relatively same Hox genes. They tell your eyes to go at the front of your head, and they tell your head to go first, then your abdomen, then what would that be? Oh no, your thorax, then your abdomen, right? So every single animal has these Hox genes, and as I put here, vertebrates like us have the same Hox genes as insects and arthropods, just different versions resulting in slightly different body plans, but they're all generally the same, and we all have these Hox genes, suggesting that all these different animals have a common ancestor that had these same Hox genes. Oops, I didn't mean to move that. So that's our second piece of evidence. Our third is embryonic similarities. Okay? Vertebrates, which are animals with a backbone like us, right, share basic body features and appearances as embryos. So as an embryo, meaning like shortly after conception and fertilization, and once you start to develop into a multicellular organism here, you're going to have a tail, you're going to have limb buds, and you're going to also have pharyngeal arches, which are kind of the precursors to having gills. Okay, so you had quasi-gills and a tail at some point in your life. And so did I, so did every other vertebrate that we've ever seen, actually. Okay, and what does that suggest? Well, once again, that suggests that all vertebrates had a common ancestor that developed in this way, that had pharyngeal arches and a tail. Okay, so here's a very famous image of 6 different embryos from 6 different species that are, you wouldn't think they'd be more closely related to each other, but they are. Take a look at row A here. All these embryos look almost exactly the same, almost indistinguishable from one another. Okay, but then as we go further on in development, you can see the major differences in the species of organisms here. But they all start in this same exact pattern. And if I just showed you A, you wouldn't probably be able to tell which one's, say, a fish and which one's a human, or which one's a turtle and which one's a chicken, so on and so forth. So embryonic similarities is a pretty telling form of evidence for evolution here. And here's an actual picture of an embryo, and there, as I said before, there's the pharyngeal arches, there's the limb buds, and there, of course, is the tail. And we're going to talk about tails here in just a second a little bit more. The fourth form of evidence is what we call comparative anatomy. So if you've ever studied anatomy before, that's the study of body parts of living things, right? And so if we're doing comparative anatomy, we are studying and comparing body parts between species of organisms here. And those can show us some patterns, some interesting patterns of evolution here and common ancestry. So the first term that I'd like you to introduce, or that I'd like to introduce to you, with regards to comparative anatomy, is homologous structures. And these are features found in different organisms that share structural similarities but have different functions. Okay, so this is an arm, okay, an arm of a person down here, this picture. And every single human being has a humerus, a radius, an ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, those sets of bones. So it's like one bone, two bones, many bones, right? This same pattern and these same bones are found throughout all different types of vertebrate species. It doesn't matter if you're a dog, a bird, or even a whale, okay? A whale with fins, right? All of these vertebrates have the same exact bone structure, which is, again, is suggesting that they all came from a common ancestor. Now, they have all the same bones, but all these bones are modified and have been tweaked over millions and millions and millions of years to allow each of these organisms to do what they have to do with their forelimbs, right? Birds have to flap their wings. Whales have to push water. Dogs have to run. We have to like grab things, right? So those are homologous structures. They're all very similar, okay, and they all have the same bones, just slightly different functions, suggesting common ancestry. And something that you may have noticed before, that, yeah, whales actually have fingers. Okay, why do whales have fingers? Well, they are what we call vestigial structures, and this is the other term that I'd like you to know about comparative anatomy. They are remnants of once important structures that have lost all or most of their function over time, and they are inherited from ancestors that once used them. So that's right, whales have fingers, suggesting that, well, the ancestor of whale species and dolphin species, they walked on land, and they actually had a purpose for having those fingers. They used them on land to walk around. If you saw earlier, I had a picture of the evolution of whales. Let's just go back to it. Oops, there we go. Okay, let's take a look at this really quick. Going back. There it is. Okay, the common ancestor of all cetaceans, aka dolphins and whales, is this Pakicetus here. And take a look. It is very much a land animal. It almost looks like a little dog / rat or something. But yeah, it is the common ancestor of all cetaceans, and it was a land animal, which explains why it has fingers and it actually has a pelvis and leg bones. So if this isn't making sense to you, guess what? You have a bunch of vestigial structures too. And why do you have wisdom teeth? You had a common ancestor that once used them. Why do you have a tailbone but no tail? Same thing. You had a common ancestor that once used his tail. Same with your appendix, and actually this fleshy part in the corner of your eye. It's the remnant of what you call a nictating membrane. So if you've ever seen like a lizard or like a bird or something kind of use its second set of eyelids and kind of go from the corner like that, that's what's called a nictating membrane, and you have the remnant of one of those. Okay, source number 5 of evidence is fossils and geological evidence. Rock strata provide insight into Earth's past. Deeper sediment layers are older than upper layers, forming gradually over billions of years. So you can find different geological evidence for evolution. You can find fossils in different layers of rock. Okay, so this layer of rock is much older than this layer of rock, and this layer of rock, and this layer of rock. And there's areas of the world, these paleontological digs, where you can find these rock strata here. Okay, and this is a really good way of determining, okay, which fossil is older than which. And before I go any further, what's even a fossil? A fossil is a preserved remain of remains of an organism or evidence of an organism's existence found in deeper layers and that are older than those in the upper layers. Okay, so in a site like this, okay, where you can see sedimentary rock being layered over on top of one another, you can find fossils within these, which is suggesting that organisms exist. See, and then you can tell which ones are older and which ones are younger based on which ones are buried deeper in the rock layers and which ones are younger based on its relativity to the surface here. Okay, and by studying changes or differences between these fossils, okay, between the older fossils and the younger fossils, you can get a larger picture of how a species has changed over time, or how groups of species have changed over time. Okay? They get slightly modified from one generation to the next, to the next generation, to the next generation, to the next generation. That's descent with modification, and that's very evidenced by these fossils. So as I said down here, it provides a picture of how species have changed over time. Okay, so one of the most, strongest forms of evidence that shows that evolution is a thing is by studying fossils that can show evolution between what we know to be extinct and what we know to be extant, meaning that they're still around here. Okay, so as I said before, dinosaurs aren't extinct. Okay, so how did a Tyrannosaurus Rex? Okay, how did that species evolve into, well, chickens? How did this species of fish evolve into reptiles here, which eventually might evolve into birds? Well, that's because from these fossils and geological evidence here, scientists have found and discovered transitional species bridging the gaps in the evolution between groups of species. Right, so check it out. This is Archaeopteryx. This is the first bird. And this was discovered in the 1800s, I think, even, and that shows that reptiles, it's kind of a link between reptiles and birds. And same with Tiktaalik over here. This is a organism here that shows a very strong link between fish and amphibians, and fish and what we call tetrapods, animals that walk around on land. Okay, so by studying fossils, we can find out bridge the gaps between forms of evidence here. Hey, we're almost done. Form of evidence number 6 is direct observation. Yes, you can see evolution happening, and you can experience evolution happening itself. Just think about, Omicron and Delta, right? Our medicines, and they're evolving in real time. Our medicines, even perhaps the vaccine might be less effective against newer forms of this virus, right? That's evolution in real time. So some species, like the types of bacteria, reproduce so quickly that we can observe a population evolve directly. And how does evolution occur? Well, we're going to talk about that in our next video when we talk about natural selection. Okay? But mutations occur in bacteria, allowing natural selection to take place and make them resistant to antibiotics. Okay, so this picture does a pretty good job showing how this works. Non-resistant bacteria exist. Bacteria multiply. They multiply and divide every 20 minutes. Some mutations make the bacterium to the drug resistant. Okay, so that when you use an antibiotic to try and kill some bacteria, say like amoxicillin, the non-resistant bacteria, the resistant bacteria are going to multiply because you got rid of all their competition. And that's how these can evolve in real time. And we're actually struggling with antibiotic resistance in the medical field right now. Same thing with different types of pests and their resistance to bed bugs and mosquitoes, their resistance to pesticides. It's the same way. Check it out. You have some that are resistant. You apply the pesticides, and then you leave a whole bunch of room for those resistant strains or those resistant individuals to multiply. And that is evolution happening in real time. Hey, and our very last form of evidence is what we call biogeography. Organisms tend to live around organisms similar to them. And the distribution of living things is best explained by plate tectonics and evolution. And the clearest example of biogeography here is that this is actually discovered almost at the same time as Darwin was studying his theory of natural selection by evolution, evolution by natural selection in Galapagos. Alfred Russel Wallace was actually studying in Indonesia here and found out that all the mammals on the eastern shores of Indonesia were marsupials, and all of these were placentals, regular mammals. Marsupials are animals that carry young in their pouch, right? So this is suggesting here that marsupials evolved separately on a separate land mass than the placental mammals, and that is one other, example of evolution here. Why else would marsupials be in one place and placentals be in the other? And that is our last form of evidence here. Okay, so please let me know if you have any questions. We're going to wrap up this video, and we'll see you next time. Bye.